Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable life and uncomfortably specific career path of a man whose ambitions unfortunately came with a catch. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born in a dusty village somewhere far enough from Beijing that maps hesitate to acknowledge it. The kind of place where chickens roam freely, elders yell at clouds, and your family's fortune consists of one bowl, 2 chopsticks, and a shared suspicion of happiness. Your father is a farmer. Your mother is also a farmer, but with more scolding and fewer breaks. You are the third son, which is the dynastic equivalent of being a spare tire. Necessary in theory, but mostly forgotten until a disaster occurs. No one names you right away. That costs money. Instead, you're called Little Third, which somehow sounds affectionate until you realize your brothers are First Ox and Second Pig. Not exactly a family of poets. Life is simple. You chase ducks, eat rice when it's available, and learn early that the world does not revolve around you, or comfort, or privacy. Your home is a one-room hut filled with relatives and the constant, humming presence of domestic disappointment. No one talks about dreams here, just the weather and the price of cabbage. Your village has 1 scholar, 1 goat, and about 20 rumours at any given time. One of those rumours is about a distant place called the Forbidden City, a palace so large it has its own weather, filled with gold, secrets and people who never farm. You are told this story while you chew on a stalk of raw millet and try to imagine what a roof made of yellow tiles even looks like. Then comes the year of drought. The crops shrivel, the river sulks, and your father starts looking at you the way a merchant looks at unused stock. You're old enough to carry water, but too young to argue. That's when the man arrives, an official-looking fellow with soft shoes and soft hands, claiming he can give you a future. Your parents smile politely. You do not understand the deal being struck, just that it involves you, your pants, and a long journey to somewhere big. You think you're being sent to learn. Technically, you are. You're about to learn that being born a nobody was just the opening act. And the main event? It's going to cost you everything below the waist. It begins with a bowl of rice, or rather the absence of one. Your family hasn't eaten properly in weeks. Your mother is grinding acorns into something suspiciously called porridge, and your father stares at a patch of dry earth like he's willing it to turn into gold. The village whispers of famine. And in this quiet, unspoken panic, the family begins to take inventory of its assets. There's no livestock, no land, no heirlooms, but there is you. A third son is a luxury in hard times. First ox is being groomed to inherit the shovel. Second pig is already betrothed to the neighbour's daughter, a feral-looking girl with strong elbows and a goat-like scream. You've shown promise at carrying water and not asking questions, a dangerous combination when your parents are having late-night talks in hushed tones. Then, one morning, the man returns. You saw him once before, dressed like a bureaucratic crane. Robes, smug smile, delicate, calloused hands that haven't touched dirt in years. He brings coins. Not many. Just enough to be insulting if they weren't being handed over in exchange for you. You think maybe you're going to study. Maybe become a monk. Maybe this is your big break. A dramatic rags to riches arc. Like in those travelling puppet plays where the youngest son becomes a hero. And then your mother hugs you. Tightly. Longer than usual. Your father can't meet your eyes. You are sold. Not into slavery, technically. That would be shameful. This is service. This is opportunity. This is the kind of selfless parental act that people will weep over at your funeral, assuming someone remembers your name by then. You leave the village with a small bag, a lump in your throat, and the faint hope that maybe this won't be as bad as it sounds. After all, you're just going to the capital, right? Big walls, fancy clothes, new life. No one tells you yet about the knife. No one mentions that this isn't just about labour. It's about transformation. The kind of transformation that involves blood, bureaucracy, and a lifetime of high-pitched silence. As the village disappears behind you, so does your boyhood. You're no longer a child. You're an investment. You'd always assumed the talk would happen at puberty. Maybe some ancient uncle would pull you aside one day, spit on the ground, and mumble something confusing about women, grain alcohol, and not trusting goats. Instead, this version of the talk involves a stern man in official robes and a scroll with way too many red stamps on it. You're now in the capital. The Forbidden City looms in the distance like a golden hallucination. But you're not there yet. First, you're in a holding facility. Part orphanage, part barracks, part ominous waiting room. The other boys around you are similarly silent, similarly confused, and similarly not ready for what comes next. Then he arrives, the explainer. He's a middle-aged eunuch with a voice so high it could kill songbirds, and a face carved into a permanent frown. He carries himself like someone who's been through things, and would prefer not to remember any of them. "Boys," he begins, "you've been chosen for a life of service." That sounds almost nice, like an honor. "You will be purified." Ah, here comes the thundercloud. There are no diagrams, no soft metaphors. Just the facts, delivered with the cold efficiency of a tax collector. You are told that the procedure is necessary. You are told it must be done for your safety and the empire's stability. You are told that the emperor's harem is sacred and that men with, shall we say, enthusiastic equipment are considered a risk. One boy faints, another runs. He gets as far as the courtyard before two guards gently but firmly remind him this is not a democracy. You try to listen, but your ears start ringing around the phrase, complete removal. There is mention of a jar, which is somehow worse. Apparently, you'll be expected to keep the contents, like a cursed souvenir, or a really unfortunate paperweight. The talk ends with a final reminder. This is the beginning of a noble path. Yes, very noble. You're to be cut, cleaned, and then sent to serve the most powerful man in China, all while being chemically incapable of enjoying even the tiniest perks of palace life. As the boys file out in stunned silence, you realize one thing. That was definitely not the talk you were expecting. They don't exactly schedule the procedure, it just happens. One moment, you're chewing on a stale steamed bun and trying to ignore the whispers from boys who heard things. The next, your name is called, and two attendants escort you to a room that smells vaguely of vinegar, fear, and misplaced ambition. The cutting room is clean. That's the first red flag. There's a low table, a basin, a few cloths, and a man who looks like he's been doing this since the Tang dynasty. He's the surgeon, though no one uses that word. He doesn't introduce himself. He doesn't ask how you're feeling. He just nods once, like a butcher inspecting a mildly disappointing pig. Then comes the tea. You're handed a bitter herbal brew said to calm the spirit. It does the opposite. Your spirit is now wide awake, pacing the walls of your skull, screaming. The next part is blurry, partially due to the shock, partially because your brain has the good sense to check out temporarily. There's a cloth gag, a warm compress, and then the moment. A cut, a tug, an absence. No screaming. Screaming wastes energy and makes you look unsophisticated. You breathe through your nose and clutch the table like it's the last piece of wood on a sinking junk ship. It's over in minutes, but it echoes through eternity. You're handed a small ceramic jar, delicately wrapped. No one explains what to do with it. You're told to keep it safe. Some eunuchs bury it. Others pray to it. A few throw it in the river and never speak of it again. You stare at it and wonder how something so small could be the toll for entering a palace. Recovery is worse. You lie on your side for days. You're not allowed to eat anything fun. Not that the porridge was ever thrilling to begin with. The older eunuchs tell you jokes that aren't funny and stories that sound suspiciously fictional. You pretend to smile, because frowning takes effort. Eventually the pain dulls, and you're upright again. But something's shifted. Not just physically, but in your place in the world. You've paid the toll. You've passed the gate. And now, you're no longer a boy from the provinces. You're a eunuch in the making. Congratulations. You've been cut, cauterized, and officially inducted into the most exclusive, least envied institution in the Empire, the Eunuch Academy. It's not a school in the traditional sense. There are no cheerful teachers or group photos. There are, however, a lot of scrolls, rules, and men, with the look of someone who's eaten nothing but duty and disappointment for 20 years. Your classmates, all boys in varying stages of trauma, shuffle around like ghosts in training. No one smiles. No one jokes. Occasionally, someone asks for their mother. No one answers. Your first lesson? Silence. You learn when to speak, rarely, how to bow, precisely, and where to keep your eyes, down, always down. The palace doesn't tolerate mistakes, especially from men who technically no longer are men. Your usefulness now depends entirely on your ability to become invisible, until needed. Then there's the walking. Apparently you've been walking wrong your entire life. There's a whole class on how to move gracefully through the Forbidden City. Not too fast, not too slow, and never ever squeaking your shoes. The master of walking is a tiny eunuch with the gait of a floating cloud and the emotional warmth of a tax audit. You're also taught how to read and write. Properly this time. Calligraphy isn't just about looking elegant. It's about proving that you're refined enough to handle palace documents without accidentally starting a war. And then comes the etiquette. Bowing to nobles. Bowing to superiors. Bowing to other eunuchs. There's so much bowing you start having conversations entirely from waist level. You're warned never to look directly at the emperor or the empress unless instructed. If you're caught gawking at a concubine, you might find yourself mysteriously reassigned to latrine duty. Graduation isn't marked by a ceremony. There's no diploma. One day, your instructor simply says, "You're ready," with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a cabbage harvest. And just like that, your name is added to a list. The list of eunuchs deemed competent enough to enter the Forbidden City. The gilded cage, the imperial pressure cooker, the world behind red walls. You've passed the first phase. You've learned the rules. Now comes the part where you serve. The gates open, and suddenly you're not in China anymore. You're inside the lungs of the dragon itself. The Forbidden City isn't just a palace. It's a labyrinth of red lacquered walls, golden roofs, courtyards so vast they have their own microclimates, and halls so quiet you can hear your self-worth evaporate. You step over the threshold and immediately feel smaller, like a dumpling in an imperial banquet. There's no warm welcome, no mentor waiting with a name tag and some light orientation. Just your handler, a senior eunuch with the personality of a particularly judgmental teapot, who mutters, "Keep up," without looking back. You do not keep up. The first courtyard alone is large enough to stage a rebellion and have room left over for a tea ceremony. You trot to catch up, praying no one notices that your shoes squeak slightly. You've been warned about squeaking. It is the sound of failure. As you walk, you're bombarded by sights. Concubines gliding past like living paintings, scholars muttering to themselves about rice allocations, and guards who look at you like you've already broken something valuable. Then comes your first task, dusting the hall of literary glory. A seemingly simple assignment, until you realize the dust includes the ever-shedding flakes of gold leaf, pigeon feathers, and the silent judgment of 10 generations of emperors. You're handed a brush, told not to sneeze, and left alone with a floor so shiny it reflects your new eunuch haircut with cruel accuracy. Midway through, a nobleman strolls by. You freeze. Not bowing could get you reassigned to chamber pot duty. Bowing incorrectly could also get you reassigned to chamber pot duty. You execute what you hope is a subtle, elegant bow. He doesn't notice. You live another hour. Lunch is a quiet affair. A bowl of lukewarm congee, and a small plate of pickled mystery. You eat fast. There's no time for digestion when etiquette is breathing down your neck. By sunset, your legs ache, your back's locked in a permanent polite stoop, and you've bowed so much your spine now bends on command. But you made it through day one. No arrests, no mistakes, no squeaking. After lunch. You're officially inside, and the city, the palace of whispers, silk, and secrets, has just begun to notice you. Let's be clear. In the Forbidden City, everyone is ranked. Eunuchs, concubines, officials, the ducks in the imperial pond, all of them have status. The difference is, the ducks don't care. You, on the other hand, are about to become very familiar with where you fall on the pecking order, and it's not near the top. Your initial rank is approximately new guy who might still cry at night. You're junior to everyone, even the eunuch who talks to birds and occasionally forgets where he lives. He's still got seniority. The hierarchy isn't written anywhere obvious. It's absorbed like mold in an old scroll. You learn fast that the man with the shinier robe gets the first bowl of congee. The one with embroidered slippers probably controls access to something important, like the Empress's chamber. The ones who stroll instead of scurry? Dangerous. Avoid eye contact. There are rankings among eunuchs based on departments. Laundry eunuchs? Low tier, permanently damp. Kitchen eunuchs? Slightly better. They smell like duck fat and have access to leftovers. The record keepers? Respected, if boring. But the real elite? The inner court eunuchs. The ones who serve the emperor directly, whisper into his ear, and somehow always look mildly unimpressed with everything. Of course, you're not there yet. You're assigned to chamber duties, the polite term for sweeping, fetching, and not asking questions. You're handed a broom, a brass key, and a firm warning about not touching anything that looks imperial, which, inconveniently, includes almost everything. Despite lacking certain parts, you still feel the usual drive to impress. So you keep your head low, speak only when summoned, and bow so often your spine starts filing complaints. Every once in a while, a rumour floats by. A fellow eunuch promoted to the emperor's quarters, one reassigned to serve the grand eunuch, or worse, exiled to the stables after a mishap involving spilled soup and a noble's silk shoes. And yet, you persist. You survive the first week without scandal. You memorize the faces of your superiors, the best paths to avoid being noticed, and how to bow with exactly the right amount of regret. Your rank is low, but you're learning. And in the Forbidden City, knowledge, even among the intact adjacent, is power. The moment arrives. You're summoned to serve in the presence of the Son of Heaven, the Emperor himself. This is the apex of your career, the peak of imperial service, and the riskiest proximity to absolute power since someone handed Caligula a horse. You wake before sunrise and prepare like you're entering battle, which, in a way, you are. One hair out of place, one awkward cough, one sneeze at the wrong moment, and you might find yourself reassigned to the imperial pig pens, a place even the pigs consider beneath them. Serving the emperor is mostly a performance of practiced invisibility. You don't speak. You don't blink too loudly. You don't exhale with opinion. You glide behind him like a particularly respectful shadow, anticipating needs you're not allowed to confirm exist. Today's assignment, pouring tea. Easy, you think, until you remember that the emperor's teacups are made of porcelain thinner than regret, and the tea leaves are measured with more ceremony than a royal wedding. The water temperature? Must be exactly correct. Not too hot, lest it offend the emperor's ki. Not too cold, or you'll be blamed for disrupting his cosmic balance and possibly his digestion. You lift the kettle. You breathe. You pour. No splashes. No drips. You did it. You're halfway through congratulating yourself internally when the emperor shifts slightly. Just a twitch of his eyebrow. You freeze, still holding the kettle. What did it mean? Was the tea too bitter? Too weak? Did he catch your reflection in the porcelain and find it unsettling? Then, without a word, the Emperor sips. No reaction. A good sign. Maybe. You bow out, walking backward with the grace of someone who's mentally replaying every micro-movement for signs of treason. Once you're out of sight, you exhale for the first time in 10 minutes. Serving the Son of Heaven requires the balance of a crane, the silence of a falling leaf, and the bladder control of a monk in a sandstorm. You are no longer a person. You are a presence, or rather, the absence of one. But you didn't sneeze. And that, in the Forbidden City, is what passes for triumph. One of the many paradoxes of life as a eunuch is this. You are simultaneously invisible and everywhere. You're not supposed to exist in the room, but you're the one refilling tea, adjusting lanterns, and pretending not to notice that Lady Plum Blossom is sobbing over a crushed love letter, while her rival, Lady Osmanthus, smirks behind a fan. You become fluent in the dialect of silence. A glance, a sigh, the subtle way someone adjusts their hairpin when lying. You learn more about the inner lives of concubines, princes, and imperial cousins than you ever wanted to. Not because you're curious, but because gossip in the palace is louder than any official decree. Let's talk about pillow talk. No, not yours. You, my friend, are about as far from pillow privileges as a rooster at a vegetarian banquet. But you're expected to clean up after the nightly dramas, literal and emotional. Love triangles, betrayal, pregnancy scares with heavy political implications, even poetry contests disguised as romantic overtures. You're not involved, of course, but you are the one burning the poems afterward. Sometimes you're stationed just outside a curtain, fanning the Emperor and his consort. You keep your eyes politely lowered, your ears diplomatically open, and your expression set to, "I am a decorative fern." Do not laugh. Not even internally. One time, a eunuch snorted during a recitation of love verses. He now tends koi ponds in a distant province, presumably still chuckling. Some eunuchs weaponize the secrets they gather, trading information up the ladder in exchange for promotion or immunity. But that game is dangerous. The wrong whisper in the wrong ear could have you reassigned, investigated, or accidentally tripping downstairs no one remembers building. Your job is to know everything and show nothing. You're a ghost with keys, a servant with a front row seat to the world's most delicate soap opera, scripted in silk and sealed with jade. And while the lovers burn with passion and power games, you polish the candelabra and try not to imagine what might have been had you been born into a different life, with all your parts intact. But hey, the tea's hot, the gossip's hotter, and you're still alive. Call that a win. By now, you've seen things, heard things, cleaned up after things you hope never make it into official chronicles. You, humble eunuch, know everything. Who's sleeping with whom? Which concubine pretends to faint for attention? Which imperial cousin writes love poems to himself and leaves them in public corridors by accident? And with that knowledge comes power, not the sword-wielding, throne-usurping type. No, yours is the subtle, velvet-gloved kind. The power of a well-timed eyebrow, a whisper that turns heads. A conveniently forgotten message. You've become the whisper between whispers. You know which tea the Emperor drinks when he's anxious. You know which official secretly fears birds. You even know where the Empress's favourite hairpin is really buried. Spoiler, it was never lost. Someone got annoyed. But you're still a eunuch, so you can't wield power like a prince. You wield it like a draft, invisible, but able to shift the entire mood of a room. Need something done? You know the kitchen eunuch whose cousin works in the archives. Need a note delivered discreetly? You know which palace maid has a soft spot for forbidden poetry. Need a scandal squashed? You know exactly how to misfile a report so it disappears for 6 months. Of course, this also makes you dangerous, which is thrilling and terrifying, mostly terrifying. You develop a new skill, plausible deniability. You never say things outright. You imply them with grace. You master the art of looking surprised by your own brilliance. You don't say, Minister Wang, "I had no idea your nephew was secretly meeting Lady Fragrance at midnight near the Peony Pavilion. What a coincidence that I found this embroidered handkerchief there." Information flows to you now. People seek you out, not for your looks, obviously, but for your uncanny ability to know. You become the court's most valuable appliance, like a teapot, but full of secrets. And though you walk softly, bow often, and smile humbly, everyone knows not to cross you. Not because you're loud, but because you never have to be. You've made yourself indispensable. And in the Forbidden City, that's more powerful than a title, a sword, or a concubine's smile. You may not have your manhood, your surname, or your own chambers with windows. But what you do have is a graduate-level education in staying alive in the most cutthroat political jungle east of the Himalayas. Welcome to Political Survival 101, Eunuch Edition. Step 1. Never be the smartest person in the room, even if you are. Especially if you are. Nothing gets a eunuch reassigned to latrine inventory faster than making a grand secretary feel like a decorative scroll. Step 2. Appear loyal, not useful. Loyal eunuchs get promoted. Useful eunuchs get blamed when things go wrong. The trick is to walk the tightrope of just helpful enough, with a touch of, I'm too dim to plot anything sinister in your expression. Step 3. Master the art of slow walking. Not literally, politically. New policy being drafted? Take your time reviewing. Rumours floating around. Wait 3 days before pretending to have heard them. Speed kills. So does eagerness. So does initiative. Step 4. Flatter strategically. A little praise for the Empress's eternal youth goes far. Just don't lay it on so thick that people suspect you're buttering her up like a dumpling wrapper. Remember, everyone here has daggers hidden in their compliments. Step 5. Rotate alliances like crops. Stay too close to one faction and you'll get burned when they fall out of favour. Switch sides too often and you're branded a weathercock. The sweet spot is trusted by all, loyal to none. You're not betraying people, you're redistributing loyalties. And above all, keep your face calm, your ears open, and your thoughts buried deeper than the Emperor's treasury. No smirking, no sighing, no expressions that could be interpreted as thinking. Your motto, I serve. Subtext, whoever's still standing. Failure in court politics means reassignment, disgrace, or exile. Success means staying precisely where you are, quietly gathering favours, and maybe, getting a better robe colour next season. You are not trying to win. You are trying to not lose. The Forbidden City doesn't remember its winners, but it definitely buries its losers in administrative silence. And so, with your best neutral smile, you nod at the passing minister and offer tea like your life depends on it. Because it does. It turns out, you don't need testosterone to climb the ladder. You need timing, subtlety, and the uncanny ability to pour tea without interrupting a treasonous conversation. Your rise begins quietly. First, you're placed in charge of the silk inventory. A small position, they say. But the Empress notices when her robes arrive smelling faintly of dumplings. You fix that. Suddenly, she remembers your name. Or rather, she remembers you're the one with the quiet feet. Next, you're given control over the ceremonial fan rotation schedule. Again, not thrilling. But remember, the concubine fanned at the wrong angle during last year's Autumn Moon Festival nearly caused a diplomatic incident. You avoid such disasters with military precision. Word gets around. Eventually, you're summoned to manage the Emperor's personal study. A room filled with scrolls, secrets, and the occasional forgotten concubine napping under the calligraphy table. You organise it all, discreetly, and in doing so, you learn even more. At some point, you're no longer that eunuch with the polite cough. You become master of the robes, or keeper of the keys, or overseer of the imperial seal polishing rotation. The title doesn't matter. It's the access. You now touch the threads that tie the palace together. Ministers nod to you in corridors. Concubines slip you notes. Servants straighten their posture when you pass, as if posture matters after castration. But hey, perception is everything. You've climbed the greasy ladder of court hierarchy without breaking a sweat. Mainly because sweating in silk is a social crime punishable by exile to broom closet duty. Of course, the higher you rise, the thinner the air, and the sharper the knives. You develop new instincts, like how to spot a poisoned mango, or how to detect sarcasm in a royal command. You've reached the realm of real influence, the shadowy layer beneath the dragon throne, and all without raising your voice, your hand, or any children. Your voice, still high, your dignity, negotiable, your power, absolute, in the most unofficial way possible. It's ironic. You were physically diminished to be less of a man, and yet here you are, quietly running the most dangerous chessboard in the Empire. All rise for the Eunuch. You survive in the Forbidden City not by sprinting ahead, but by not being the one who falls behind. And lucky for you, others do plenty of that, gloriously, publicly, sometimes with a very audible thud. It starts with whispers, a misplaced document, a concubine's complaint, a poem interpreted a little too politically. Suddenly, Minister Chen is taking a leave of absence to reflect on his errors, which is court speak for hasn't been seen since Tuesday. You learn to recognize the signs, a sudden drop in lacquered smiles, guards appearing where they normally don't, the eunuch shuffle, where someone who had power yesterday now carries incense sticks and avoids eye contact. You watch from the shadows as others trip on their own ambition. The loud ones go first, those who mistake the emperor's chuckle for immunity. The poetic ones usually follow. Apparently metaphor is only charming until someone mistakes it for sedition. And then come the eunuchs. Yes, your colleagues. Trusted confidants one day, reassigned to pigsty sanitation the next. All it takes is a misinterpreted nod or an intercepted note. One poor soul got demoted because he coughed right as the emperor sneezed. Suspicious timing, indeed. You master the art of the strategic absence. When tempers rise, you're tending to tea inventory. When scandal breaks, you're fetching scrolls. You never laugh too hard, never frown too deep. Your emotions are trimmed, like your future always was. And when your rival finally falls, that smug eunuch who always wore his sash too tight and quoted Confucius like he wrote it himself, you don't smile. You offer condolences, sincerely. Then immediately check who's inheriting his duties and which door they forgot to lock. Because in the Forbidden City, every downfall leaves a vacuum. And while power abhors a vacuum, you love one. Especially if it comes with a window-facing chamber and upgraded ceremonial slippers. You didn't push them. You simply outlasted them. And as another official is led away under review, you sip your tea, nod politely, and pretend not to notice the guards swapping nameplates. It's not about being innocent. It's about being uninteresting. For now. After decades of silent nods, perfectly timed tea pours, and never once getting credit for stopping 3 coups with a single eyebrow raise, you've made it to the final boss level of eunuchdom. Retirement. Or at least, the theory of it. See, there's no formal gold watch ceremony in the Forbidden City. No pension, no speech, no heartfelt hugs. Just one morning, if you're lucky, you're told, your service is no longer required. Which, in imperial phrasing, is both a reward and a mild threat. The surviving few who make it that far? They're a strange bunch, a living museum of who not to cross. Some shuffle off to temple service, their robes smelling faintly of incense and long-held secrets. Others retreat to modest villas, paid for in untraceable favours, and gifts they were definitely not supposed to accept. And some, the truly paranoid, stay, not working, just hovering, offering unsolicited advice, smiling at court dinners like ghosts with unpaid debts. You, however, are playing it smart. You've arranged a small estate far enough from the capital that rumours don't travel, but close enough to hear when someone important dies. You don't need to be in the game anymore. You just need to hear it being played. Still, retirement is no paradise. You wake at 5 a.m. out of habit. You find yourself correcting your servant's posture. You wince when someone pours tea clockwise. It's like muscle memory mixed with trauma. Call it imperial PTSD, the irony. After years of sacrificing everything, family, identity, anatomy, your reward is peace, not joy, not fame, just the absence of threat. No one trying to poison your noodles, no one plotting behind curtains, no one mistaking your silence for subversion. But some nights you miss it. The tension, the gossip, the way a well-placed nod could change a dynasty. So you sit under your plum tree, sipping tea, still hot, still silent, and wonder how the next eunuch is doing back at court, probably sweating. Poor lad's probably using the wrong fan schedule. You smirk. Not out of cruelty, out of graduation. You've outlived politics, and in the Forbidden City, that makes you royalty. Almost. In the grand tale of Chinese dynasties, emperors are etched in stone, generals sung in opera, concubines immortalized in painted screens, and eunuchs? We are the soft threads stitched into palace silk, hidden, essential, forgotten by name but not by impact. You never had children. You weren't supposed to. But you mentored 3 generations of courtiers, trained countless tea pourers to avoid splashback scandals, and once prevented a civil war by suggesting the emperor take a nap. That counts for something. Your legacy isn't in portraits. Those were reserved for people with, well, testicles. But every scroll you archived, every secret you buried beneath layers of etiquette, every crisis you prevented with a and a strategic eyebrow raise, those rippled through history. Years later, a minor official publishes a treatise on palace management, a bestseller. He thanks a mysterious advisor whose silence was his wisdom. That was you. Not that anyone will ask. You bequeath your modest estate to a monastery. They build a quiet garden in your honor. Nothing too grand. Just a stone bench beneath a plum tree, inscribed with a proverb so vague even scholars argue about its meaning. Your name disappears from records. But the systems you created, the networks you wove, the art of surviving power without wielding it, those remain. Some whisper your name in court when problems get solved too efficiently. Others claim you never existed, a legend invented by anxious junior eunuchs to explain why no one dares reorganize the seal cabinet. Either way, you've done it. You carved influence out of silence, rose without force, and became indispensable by being ignorable, a masterpiece of presence by absence. So, in your final years, as you sip jasmine tea under that old plum tree, you think back on it all, the pain, the politics, the secrets, and chuckle. Not bad for someone everyone expected to fade quietly into silk. History may not shout your name, but it echoes your footsteps in every polished hallway and every whispered council. And in the Forbidden City, that's immortality. Step inside the towering stone halls of a medieval castle, and you would quickly realize that silence was not the natural state of such a place. Behind the thick walls and under the flickering torchlight, sound was carefully curated. It was a tool of power, a display of wealth, and a way to fill the otherwise cold atmosphere with life. And the ones responsible for weaving this auditory tapestry were the minstrels. These travelling musicians were more than background noise. They carried stories across kingdoms, stitching together distant regions with their ballads. A minstrel could recount the heroics of a knight who had never set foot in that castle, or whisper through melody the scandal of a noble whose reputation stretched far and wide. Their instruments varied, the lute with its sweet plucked strings, the harp, graceful and commanding, the drum echoing like a heartbeat through the great hall. When these sounds collided, they transformed the draughty chambers into a theatre of memory and imagination. But minstrels were not just entertainers, they were custodians of narrative. In a world where literacy was rare, songs preserved lineages, victories, and betrayals. Nobles relied on them to immortalize triumphs in verse, while peasants gathered scraps of history through the refrains. To hear a minstrel sing of your family's deeds was to carve your name into cultural permanence, and to have no songs sung of you was a quiet form of erasure. For the lords and ladies, having minstrels perform during a feast or celebration wasn't just indulgence, it was a political statement. The music proved that the castle had wealth enough to spare for art, that its lord was cultured, and that his name deserved to echo in song. A castle without minstrels was like a crown without jewels. Functional, but lacking its proper brilliance, as the banquet tables groaned under roasted meats and the goblets brimmed with spiced wine. Minstrels gave rhythm to the revelry. Their lyrics could uplift spirits, soften tensions, or even slyly critique those present, all under the protective veil of song. And when their music swelled through the rafters, even the cold stone seemed to hum along, as though the very castle walls had a heartbeat of their own. If the minstrels were the voice of history and song, then the jester was the living pulse of comedy inside the castle walls. To modern ears, a jester might sound like nothing more than a clown with a silly hat and bells, but in the medieval world, their role was both riskier and more powerful than most realise. They weren't just comic relief. They were the only ones in the hall with the rare privilege of mocking power. Dressed in motley colours, their caps tipped with jingling bells, jesters carried a licence no knight, noble or servant dared to claim, the licence to speak freely. In a society defined by hierarchy, where a misplaced word could end a life, jesters were allowed to parody their lords, to poke fun at their flaws, and even to hint at uncomfortable truths. Their humour was a pressure valve, a way to release tension in a room thick with politics and ambition. But this freedom came with danger. A joke that fell flat or cut too close to the bone could turn fatal. History remembers tales of jesters who were whipped or worse for a poorly timed jest. Yet the clever ones knew how to walk the razor's edge, disguising truths in riddles and laughter. In their wordplay and mimicry, lords sometimes found uncomfortable reflections of themselves. And while the noble hall roared with laughter, the lord himself often had to pretend he too was amused, even if the sting of the truth lingered. The jester's role was not limited to courtly comedy. They could sing, juggle, recite poetry, perform acrobatics, or even offer sharp political commentary disguised as nonsense. In many ways, they were medieval social commentators, their jokes working as both entertainment and subtle criticism. For the castle folk, the jester was both beloved and feared. He was the one who could take a serious banquet and turn it into a spectacle of laughter, or whisper mockery into the crowd's ears about nobles who thought themselves untouchable. In a hall designed for order and display, the jester brought glorious chaos, and in doing so, kept everyone just a little more honest. The clanging bells of his cap were more than mere decoration. They were a reminder that, in a world of rigid rank and ritual, truth sometimes came best wrapped in folly. If music and jest filled the halls, then tournaments shook the very ground beneath the castle walls. To the medieval imagination, nothing embodied both entertainment and prestige like the tournament. These were not casual games. They were staged dramas of power, designed to impress allies, intimidate rivals, and dazzle the crowds who gathered to watch knights transform warfare into spectacle. A tournament was part sport, part theatre, and part battlefield rehearsal. The most famous event was the joust, where two armoured knights thundered down a tilt-yard on massive destriers, lances poised to shatter on shields or helmets. The clash was deafening. The splinter of wood, the roar of the crowd, the possibility of a man unhorsed sprawled in the mud. For nobles, it was a showcase of martial skill. For spectators, it was raw entertainment, the medieval equivalent of a prize fight. But the joust was only one piece of the spectacle. There were melees, where dozens of knights clashed in chaotic mock battles, often blurring the line between game and genuine danger. These melees were notorious for injuries and occasionally deaths, but danger only heightened the drama. To see a lord's champion ride victorious through the field was to see honour itself defended. Beyond the fighting, tournaments were drenched in ceremony. Banners fluttered from castle towers, trumpets announced the challengers, and ladies of the court bestowed favours, ribbons, scarves or tokens, to the knights they supported. These tokens, tied to helmets or lances, gave the combat a romantic edge, turning blood and bruises into gestures of devotion. For the hosting lord, A tournament was more than entertainment. It was propaganda. It proved his wealth, for only the rich could sponsor such costly pageantry. It proved his power, for knights travelled from distant lands to fight under his gaze. And it proved his refinement, as the violence of war was reshaped into carefully staged sport. The tournaments also served a practical function, keeping knights sharp in peacetime. A warrior who had not tasted the chaos of combat could at least rehearse it here, before the eyes of cheering crowds. In the end, a tournament was more than broken lances and battered armour. It was a stage where valour was displayed, alliances were strengthened, and the castle declared its place in the hierarchy of power. When the tournaments ended and the clash of steel faded, entertainment in the castle often turned its gaze skyward. There, in the sweep of wings and the strike of talons, the nobility found another form of spectacle: falconry. To medieval lords and ladies, this was not merely a pastime. It was an art, a symbol of status, and a demonstration of harmony between man and nature. A falcon, hawk, or goshawk perched on a gloved wrist was more than a hunting companion. It was a badge of rank. The type of bird one flew was dictated by strict custom. Emperors with eagles, kings with gyrfalcons, nobles with hawks, and lower ranks with kestrels. To be seen with the wrong bird was not just a breach of etiquette, it was a scandal, as much a faux pas as wearing another lord's crest. Training these birds required patience, skill, and above all, resources. A falconer, often a highly valued servant in a lord's household, oversaw the delicate process of taming and teaching the bird. They learned to respond to whistles, to return to the glove, and to strike prey with lethal precision. Watching a bird stoop from the sky, wings folded, plummeting with terrifying speed toward a hare or pheasant, was a performance in itself, a marriage of grace and violence. But falconry was more than the hunt. It was courtship, diplomacy, and ceremony rolled into one. Ladies of the court often took part, their jewelled gloves holding sleek, hooded birds. A falcon gifted between nobles could seal alliances or demonstrate favour. Even love poetry of the age wove falconry into its verses, equating the longing of a falcon for its master with the yearning of a lover for their beloved. Outings for falconry were grand affairs. Lords and ladies rode on horseback into the countryside, birds perched on gauntleted hands, entourages trailing behind. Trumpets sometimes accompanied their departure, turning the mere act of hunting into a choreographed display. Success was celebrated back at the castle with feasts, where the story of the bird's strike became part of the evening's entertainment. In a world where war was constant and survival often harsh, falconry offered the nobility a vision of elegance and mastery. It proved that even in the brutality of nature, the hand of the castle could command beauty and order. And when the falcon returned, settling back on its master's wrist, it carried not just prey, but prestige. If falconry filled the skies with spectacle, the banquet hall filled the stomach and dazzled the senses. In the medieval castle, a feast was never simply about eating. It was a staged performance, where food, music, and ritual blended into a theatre of power. To dine at a great hall's table was to participate in an event where every bite, every gesture, and every sound reinforced the hierarchy of the castle. Picture the setting: long wooden tables groaning under the weight of roasted boar, venison, and whole swans wrapped in their own plumage for display. Trenches of bread replaced plates, soaking up stews and sauces. Candles flickered across silver goblets brimming with spiced wine or mead. At the high table, the lord and his family sat elevated, both literally and symbolically, while guests arranged themselves by rank below. To be seated closer to the lord was not just an honour, it was a statement of influence. The entertainment at a banquet was layered. Minstrels and musicians provided a steady flow of song, weaving tales between courses. Dancers, acrobats, or trained animals might perform between dishes, adding surprise and variety to the evening. For special occasions, spectacles were staged. Live birds released from pies, sugar sculptures shaped into castles, or dishes dyed in unnatural colours to astonish the eye as much as the palate. The food itself was part of the entertainment. Exotic spices from the East, rare fruits, or imported wines were all displayed with pride, proof of the Lord's wealth and connections. Even the preparation of certain dishes, such as peacocks with their feathers reattached after roasting, turned the meal into a living art form. Guests weren't just eating. They were being reminded of their host's power to command abundance in a world where hunger was never far away. But feasts were also about sound. Toasts were shouted, jesters joked between courses, and sometimes political bargains or marriage alliances were struck over the breaking of bread. To outsiders, these gatherings might appear as indulgence, but to the castle's inhabitants, they were stages where loyalty was reaffirmed, enemies were impressed, and bonds were sealed. By the time the last goblet was drained, and the hall grew heavy with the smell of smoke and spice, the feast had done its work. The guests left with full bellies, music in their ears, and a renewed sense of their lord's magnificence. Beyond music, jest, and feasts, castles also became stages for drama and pageantry, performances that blended theatre, ritual, and politics. In a world without printed novels or glowing screens, plays were living stories, unfolding before noble and peasant alike, often inside the great hall or in the castle courtyard. The themes were rarely random. Many plays drew from biblical stories or morality tales, turning theatre into instruction as much as entertainment. Audiences might watch the fall of Adam and Eve, the parables of Christ, or allegories where characters like virtue and vice battled for a man's soul. But beneath the solemnity lay a truth. Lords used these plays to display not only piety, but their ability to bring culture into their halls. The castle became both a fortress and a cathedral of performance. Not all drama was religious, however. Secular plays, full of humour and mischief, echoed through stone corridors. Farces lampooned greedy merchants, jealous husbands, and gullible peasants. Courtly romances dramatised knights and maidens, while travelling troops added their own flair, often with masks, costumes, and slapstick antics. Just as minstrels carried song, actors carried laughter and story from castle to castle, weaving Europe together with shared tales. Pageantry, however, went beyond staged drama. It included elaborate processions, costumed parades, and symbolic displays of power. A visiting king might be greeted not just with banners and trumpets, but with a choreographed sequence of allegorical figures. A maiden representing peace, a knight representing justice, a fool representing fortune. Each figure delivered verses or gestures, layering symbolism onto the politics of welcome. For the audience, these events were mesmerizing. To peasants allowed inside the courtyard, the spectacle was a rare brush with splendor. For the nobility, it was reassurance that their world was not only ordered, but gilded with meaning. And for the lord of the castle, it was a chance to craft narrative, to remind guests and subjects alike that his reign was not brute force alone, but also culture, wisdom, and magnificence. At times, pageantry could blur into politics so completely that entertainment became propaganda. A staged allegory could subtly warn rivals or flatter allies, its lessons draped in spectacle. To laugh at a play, to gasp at a parade, was to absorb a message carefully designed for the occasion. Behind stone walls, drama was not idle amusement. It was performance with purpose. Storytelling turned into power. When the torches dimmed and the feast tables were cleared, castles often transformed into spaces of rhythm and movement. Music and dance were the lifeblood of evening entertainment, binding nobles together in displays of elegance and order. Unlike the rough spectacle of tournaments or the chaotic humour of jesters, dance was carefully choreographed, a reminder that even joy in the castle was measured, ritualized, and steeped in meaning. Musicians, often stationed in the gallery above the great hall, played lutes, fiddles, flutes, or shawms, their melodies cascading into the chamber below. These sounds were not random. Each instrument had its place in signalling the refinement of the court. A lord who could employ skilled musicians proved his wealth and sophistication. For guests, the music set the stage for social maneuvering. Alliances whispered in the pauses, flirtations disguised in polite conversation, rivalries sharpened beneath the smiles. Dancing itself carried layers of symbolism. The most common forms were line dances and circle dances, where participants moved in unison to repetitive tunes. Later, more intricate steps like the bass dance or carol appeared, requiring balance, grace, and an awareness of one's partner. For nobles, these dances were not just fun. They were lessons in discipline and coordination, physical reflections of the order that defined their world. To stumble was not just embarrassing, it betrayed a lack of refinement. Ladies and lords alike displayed their finery on these dance floors. Jewels glittered, gowns swirled, and the movements of the dancers turned the great hall into a living tapestry. In some cases, dance served as a courtship ritual, a way for suitors to display charm without violating the rigid codes of behavior that governed noble interactions. A glance held too long, a step too close, a whispered word during a turn. All of it was charged with meaning. But music and dance were not limited to nobles. During festivals or special occasions, servants, soldiers, and villagers might be invited to join in simpler dances, blurring the lines of rank for a fleeting moment. Even then, the Lord's presence loomed, for the dance was as much about unity under his rule as it was about merriment. In the castle, music and dance were never idle distractions. They were ceremonies of grace, where laughter and movement masked the constant awareness of rank, reputation, and power. Every step was entertainment, but also statement. Entertainment in the castle was not confined to the great hall or courtyard. Beyond pageantry and feasting, lords and ladies filled their days with hunting, games, and quiet pastimes that blended relaxation with displays of skill and status. These activities, while seemingly leisurely, were woven into the fabric of power and prestige that defined castle life. Hunting was the crown of noble leisure. To ride out at dawn, hounds barking, horns echoing through the forest, was to enact a ritual of dominance, not just over animals, but over land itself. The right to hunt was fiercely guarded. It marked a noble's privilege and separated him from peasants, for whom poaching in the lord's forests could mean severe punishment. The hunt was more than sport. It was practice for war. Handling horses, coordinating with others, and mastering weapons like the bow or spear sharpened martial skills while cloaked in entertainment. A successful hunt ended in ceremony, with the kill presented in triumph back at the castle, feasts prepared, and stories retold by the fire. Inside the castle walls, leisure took quieter forms. Board games like chess were especially favoured among the nobility. To move pawns, knights, and queens across a checkered board was more than strategy. It was metaphor. Chess echoed the rigid hierarchies of medieval life, each piece locked into its ordained role, victory belonging only to those who mastered the balance of power. Backgammon, dice, and card-like games also filled long winter evenings, their outcomes often spiced with wagers. Even storytelling itself was a pastime. Nobles might gather to hear romances of Arthurian knights or epics of Troy, recited aloud in candle-lit chambers. These tales offered escape, but they also reinforced ideals of chivalry, love, and loyalty, virtues that lords wanted their courts to embody, even if reality rarely matched the fantasy. Women of the castle, too, had their diversions. Embroidery, music practice, poetry, or falconry alongside the men. Their activities, though often more domestic, still functioned as performances of refinement. A noblewoman's skill with lute or needle was another jewel in her household's crown. From roaring hunts to silent games of thought, the leisure of lords was never simple diversion. Each pastime reflected status, sharpened skill, or reinforced ideals. Even in moments of play, the castle was a stage where every act, from a chess move to a gallop through the woods, proclaimed power. While much of castle entertainment catered to nobles and their guests, the grandest displays were often the festivals, occasions when the castle opened its gates and transformed into the beating heart of the surrounding community. These were moments when stone walls no longer symbolized only defense, but also celebration, joy, and a carefully staged sense of unity. Festivals were tied to the rhythms of the year: Easter, Christmas, harvest season, or the feast days of saints. On such occasions, the Great Hall became a theatre of abundance. Tables overflowed with food and drink, musicians filled the air with song, and dancers stamped out rhythms that echoed across the courtyard. Minstrels recited heroic epics, while jesters performed tricks to laughter that carried into the night. For a brief time, hierarchy softened. Peasants might be admitted into the castle grounds to witness the revelry, though never forgetting their place. One of the most dazzling spectacles was the mask or costume procession. Nobles and courtiers dressed as allegorical figures, gods, virtues, or legendary heroes, parading before the audience in ornate pageants. These performances blurred entertainment with propaganda. When a lord appeared as Mars, god of war or justice personified, the message was clear. The castle was not just hosting merriment, it was declaring its authority wrapped in silk and symbolism. Tournaments were often woven into festivals, accompanied by parades of armoured knights, trumpeting fanfares, and heraldic displays that turned the castle courtyard into a living tapestry of colour. Falconry demonstrations, mock battles and dances followed, ensuring that every sense, sight, sound, taste, and touch, was saturated with grandeur. Fireworks, in later centuries, and torchlit spectacles made the nights blaze with light. Even religion had its place in these celebrations. Processions to the castle chapel, solemn masses, and blessings from priests framed the merriment with spiritual legitimacy. The message was subtle but powerful. The Lord's rule was not only magnificent, but divinely sanctioned. For common folk, festivals were rare glimpses of a world otherwise closed to them. For nobles, they were a chance to reinforce hierarchy under the veil of joy. And for the castle itself, festivals transformed cold stone into a stage of warmth and spectacle, ensuring that its reputation echoed far beyond its walls. Entertainment in the castle was never just distraction, it was theatre, designed to charm, impress, and remind all who watched that beneath the pageantry lay power. In the autumn of 1095, a French pope named Urban II stood before a vast crowd in the town of Clermont. His voice carried through the square, filled with urgency and fire. He declared that the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the most sacred site of Christendom, lay under the control of Muslim powers, and that it was the duty of Christians to reclaim it. To those who joined, he promised the ultimate reward, the forgiveness of sins and eternal salvation. What happened next would shock even Urban himself. His words spread like wildfire across Europe, not just among armoured knights, but among peasants, artisans, monks, widows, and even children. The call was not framed as a campaign for the wealthy alone, but as a sacred pilgrimage open to all. Chroniclers tell us that the crowd erupted in a thunderous cry, Deus vult, God wills it. That chant became the rallying cry of the First Crusade. For many who listened, this was not simply a summons to war. It was a chance to wash away guilt, to seek adventure, or to find divine purpose in an age plagued by famine and unrest. Lords saw opportunity for land and wealth. Poor farmers saw a path to escape hardship. Families discussed the Pope's words around hearth fires, weighing the risks of leaving everything behind. In countless villages, husbands and wives decided together that the journey was worth the danger, and that their children would march with them toward the Holy Land. The appeal of Urban's sermon reached beyond France. Messengers carried the news into the German lands, across Italy, and into England. Leaders like Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Bohemond of Taranto began preparing armies. Yet alongside these nobles, thousands of nameless men and women sewed crosses onto their tunics, vowing to walk eastward with nothing but faith, rations, and determination. The call to the cross did not create one crusade, but many. Some were organised and led by lords with clear military objectives. Others, like the ill-fated People's Crusade, were spontaneous movements of peasants and zealots. But in every case, the foundation had been laid by Urban's words at Clermont. The idea of marching to Jerusalem with entire households, not just knights, but wives, sons and daughters, was born in that moment. The First Crusade began not on a battlefield, but in the echo of a sermon that turned Europe's restless energy toward the east. When the First Crusade began, it was not just knights tightening the straps of their armour. Whole families set out together, turning the military campaign into something closer to a mass migration. Villages emptied, farm tools were abandoned, and the roads of Europe filled with men, women, children, and the elderly, trudging eastward in long, ragged columns. These were not armies in the professional sense. Behind the mounted knights and their retainers came streams of peasants with carts piled high with bedding, utensils, and crude provisions. Oxen pulled wagons creaking under the weight of families' few possessions. Mothers walked with infants strapped to their backs, while children scampered barefoot, herding goats or carrying water. Elderly parents, too frail for war but unwilling to be left behind, leaned on staffs as they followed their kin. For these families, the march was not simply a campaign, it was a pilgrimage of survival and faith. The image of knights charging under bright banners is only half the truth. The reality was that women cooked meals over roadside fires, tended wounds, and kept children alive in the endless days of walking. Children themselves endured hunger, exhaustion, and exposure. They were not mere onlookers, but participants, fetching water from rivers, carrying firewood, or leading pack animals. In this way, the crusading movement blurred the line between military endeavour and communal migration. The journey quickly exposed the hardships awaiting them. Food was scarce, and prices skyrocketed along the route as merchants exploited the sudden influx of hungry pilgrims. Families sometimes sold what little they had, tools, clothing, even heirlooms, to buy bread. Hunger and thirst were constant companions. Entire households grew gaunt as they pressed forward, sustained only by the conviction that Jerusalem was worth every sacrifice. Despite the struggle, the movement of families also gave the crusade resilience. Where knights alone might have faltered, the presence of women and children gave the expedition a sense of purpose beyond conquest. To abandon the march would mean not just a failed campaign, but a broken pilgrimage, a betrayal of vows made before God. As the roads east filled with this unlikely multitude, Europe witnessed something it had never seen before, an armed pilgrimage that was also a wandering community. The march of families, fragile, determined, and bound by faith, gave the First Crusade its human face. Before the great lords of Europe even set out, another wave of crusaders had already begun their march, an unorganized movement later called the People's Crusade. Inspired by Pope Urban's call, thousands of peasants, small landholders, monks, and beggars gathered behind charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit and Walter Sans-Avoir. Unlike the noble-led forces that would follow, these groups were ill-prepared, poorly armed, and dangerously vulnerable. Yet they carried the same zeal, and in many cases, even greater desperation. For families who joined this early wave, the journey was filled with chaos from the start. With little discipline, they marched eastward without enough supplies, relying on local villages for food or resorting to theft. Along the way, tragedies unfolded. Pogroms erupted in the Rhineland, where some crusaders turned on Jewish communities, massacring men, women and children in a twisted attempt to begin their holy war at home. For the families travelling peacefully, these acts sowed fear and mistrust, tainting the religious fervour that had inspired them. The march across Europe was brutal. Children starved on the roadside, and parents bartered away clothing for scraps of bread. Women laboured under the weight of both pilgrimage and motherhood, giving birth on the road or nursing infants in fields along the Danube. Unlike the professional knights who would later receive support from Byzantine allies, these early groups arrived at Constantinople ragged, exhausted, and half-starved. Emperor Alexios Komnenos, wary of their disorder, quickly ferried them across the Bosporus to Anatolia, hoping to keep them away from his capital. What awaited them in Asia Minor was disaster. Lacking proper weapons and strategy, the People's Crusade fell into ambushes by the Seljuk Turks. Families who had marched for months were slaughtered on the plains of Anatolia. Accounts describe children cut down, women captured, and men annihilated. Very few survived. Peter the Hermit himself returned to Constantinople, while Walter Sans-Avoir perished in battle. For all its tragedy, the People's Crusade revealed something vital: that the First Crusade was not just a campaign of knights and nobles, but also of ordinary families swept up in religious passion. Their deaths were a grim foreshadowing of the hunger, hardship, and peril yet to come. The People's Crusade was crushed, but it left behind a powerful image: that thousands of nameless families had already laid down their lives before the main armies even set foot in the Holy Land. After the tragic collapse of the People's Crusade, the true military expedition, later called the Prince's Crusade, began its march. Unlike the ragged bands of peasants, this wave was led by some of Europe's most powerful nobles: Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon with his brother Baldwin, Bohemond of Taranto, and Hugh of Vermandois, the brother of the King of France. Their armies were larger, better supplied, and more disciplined, but still they were not composed of knights alone. Families, servants, and camp followers travelled alongside, transforming these armies into moving communities. A knight rarely travelled without his household. Wives joined their husbands, either out of devotion or necessity, while children clung to wagons that carried the family's possessions. Servants cooked, cleaned, and maintained equipment, while peasants tagged along, hoping to share in divine reward or earthly spoils. This meant that every encampment resembled a small town: blacksmiths hammering, cooks preparing meals, priests leading prayers, and children playing in the dust while soldiers sharpened swords. For these families, the march east was both pilgrimage and ordeal. Though better organized than the People's Crusade, shortages soon appeared. Grain was expensive, water scarce, and disease ever present. Women often became healers and caretakers, tending to the sick and burying the dead. They also endured hardships unique to their position, vulnerable to both hunger and violence along the way. Yet chronicles also speak of their resilience, carrying water during sieges, cheering soldiers in battle, and keeping households intact under the strain of war. When the Crusaders reached Constantinople, the sheer scale of the Prince's Crusade astonished the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos. Tens of thousands poured into his capital, not only knights, but also women pushing carts and children clinging to their parents. Alexios, cautious after the disaster of the People's Crusade, demanded oaths of loyalty from the leaders before helping them cross into Asia Minor. To the families waiting in the camps outside the city, politics mattered little. Survival and faith drove them forward. The Prince's Crusade marked a turning point. With professional soldiers and noble leaders, it had the military strength to face the Seljuk Turks. But because so many families marched alongside the knights, it also carried the human weight of pilgrimage. This was not only a war for Jerusalem, but a movement of entire households, each step eastward blending the ambitions of lords with the faith of ordinary families. Once ferried across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, the Crusaders discovered that the greatest enemy was not always the Seljuk Turks, but the land itself. The Anatolian plateau stretched wide and unforgiving, a furnace of dust, rock, and heat. For the families trudging alongside the knights, this crossing was less like a military campaign, and more like a slow-motion disaster of hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. The armies had marched from fertile Europe, where rivers and villages punctuated every day's journey, into a world of barren plains. Wells were few, streams often dried, and Seljuk horsemen deliberately burned crops and poisoned wells to starve the Crusaders. Men in armour collapsed under the sun, horses withered, and families pushed wagons that sank into the dust. Children wept for water, mothers tried to nurse infants despite their own thirst, and the old often fell by the roadside, unable to rise again. Food became a matter of life and death. Knights sometimes rationed their grain to keep camp followers alive, but shortages were constant. Families scavenged roots, gathered herbs, or slaughtered pack animals meant for carrying supplies. Dogs, horses, and even leather straps were boiled into meagre stews. To many crusaders, it felt less like a holy pilgrimage than a test of endurance, where survival itself became proof of divine favour. And yet, amid the misery, resilience shone. Chronicles describe women carrying water to soldiers during skirmishes with Turkish raiders, standing firm even as arrows whistled overhead. Children too young to fight still served, herding the last goats and donkeys, or helping to gather firewood for the nightly camps. These small acts of endurance kept the crusading host moving when despair threatened to break it apart. The Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097 marked the climax of this ordeal. The Crusaders, ambushed by Seljuk forces, nearly collapsed under the assault. Families huddled behind wagons as knights struggled to hold the line. But when reinforcements arrived, the Crusaders won a hard-fought victory. For the families, survival meant more than triumph. It meant they could continue eastward, one step closer to Jerusalem. The crossing of Asia Minor etched suffering into every memory. It was a crucible that burned away illusions of easy victory. For knights, it hardened resolve. For the families who endured hunger and thirst together, it became a pilgrimage carved in sweat and grief. Proof that this was not just a soldier's war, but a test of entire households. By the autumn of 1097, the crusading host reached the great city of Antioch, one of the largest fortresses in the Near East. To take it meant controlling the gateway to Jerusalem, but Antioch's massive walls, towers, and garrison turned the siege into a nightmare that dragged on for months. For the soldiers, it was a battle of attrition. For the families who had followed them, it was a descent into hunger, disease, and despair. The Crusaders surrounded the city, cutting off supplies. Yet the blockade worked both ways. While the defenders endured inside, the besiegers suffered outside. Families had no protection from the rain and cold of winter. Makeshift huts of branches and canvas offered little shelter, and disease swept through the overcrowded camps. Children weakened first, their cries filling the night, while mothers tried in vain to stretch dwindling rations of barley or horseflesh into meals. Hunger became the siege's defining torment. Chronicles describe soldiers eating roots, boiled leather, and even the corpses of animals that had long since starved. Families shared these desperate meals, sometimes surviving on little more than grass. Rumours spread of cannibalism at the siege's worst moments, an unthinkable act that showed just how far desperation pushed ordinary people. Despite this, the presence of women and children gave the Crusaders an added burden of purpose. Wives tended wounds and carried water, often stepping onto the battlefield itself to help the injured. Children helped gather firewood or keep watch for enemy sorties. These small acts of endurance reminded the Crusaders that their march was not only for conquest, but also for the families who shared their suffering. Inside Antioch, the defenders resisted fiercely, while outside, the besiegers faced counterattacks and the constant threat of starvation. Morale collapsed more than once, and some leaders considered abandoning the siege entirely. Yet betrayal within the city, a tower handed over by a discontented guard, finally allowed the Crusaders to storm Antioch in June 1098. Victory, however, brought little relief. Almost immediately, a vast Muslim army under Kerbogha of Mosul advanced, trapping the Crusaders inside the very city they had just taken. For families who had endured the hunger of the siege, survival now meant enduring yet another, with walls turned from hope into prison. The siege of Antioch proved that the First Crusade was not just fought by knights in shining armour. It was endured by families huddled in tents, starving by campfires, and clinging to faith that God's will would deliver them. After the ordeal of Antioch, the Crusaders pressed southward, though many families had already been reduced to shadows of what they once were. It was now 1099, 3 years since Pope Urban's call, and those still marching had endured famine, battles, and disease. What remained of the vast host looked less like an army, and more like a caravan of survivors. Knights leading weary horses, women carrying infants, children stumbling with bare feet, and old men leaning on staffs as they limped toward the holy city. The land of Syria and Palestine brought new challenges. Heat replaced the cold of Anatolia, and the blazing sun scorched travelers by day. Water was scarce, and families rationed every drop they carried in skins and jars. Food remained unpredictable, purchased from local villagers when possible, but often taken by force. Chroniclers describe the Crusaders gnawing at bitter roots or slaughtering exhausted pack animals to survive. For women and children, each mile south was a test of sheer endurance. Still, the march carried a sense of destiny. The survivors believed their suffering had meaning, that every child buried by the roadside and every night spent starving in a campfire's glow was part of a divine trial. Priests walked among the pilgrims, lifting crosses high and chanting prayers, while families knelt together, begging for strength to complete the final steps. Encounters with local populations were tense. Some Christian villages welcomed the Crusaders, offering bread and shelter. Others, wary of the vast and unruly host, shut their gates. Muslim defenders harried the columns, striking suddenly and vanishing into the hills. Families huddled behind wagons as knights rode out to protect them, turning the march itself into a battlefield. By the time the Crusaders reached the approaches to Jerusalem in early June, their numbers had been cut to a fraction of those who had first taken the cross. Yet within the weary multitude, families still trudged forward. Mothers clutched children who had grown thin from years of hardship, while fathers prayed they would live to see the city. The march was not only a military advance, but a pilgrimage carved in suffering. Every step toward Jerusalem was both agony and hope. The city's golden dome glimmered on the horizon, a promise that the ordeal of 3 years was nearing its climax. For the families who had survived this far, the march to Jerusalem was less conquest than covenant, proof that faith had carried them across half the world. In June of 1099, the Crusaders finally stood before the walls of Jerusalem. Yet instead of immediate triumph, they faced another ordeal, a fortified city stocked with defenders and supplies, while the crusading host arrived exhausted, starved, and ill-prepared for a long siege. For the families who had survived 3 years of hardship, this final chapter was as grueling as anything that had come before. The first challenge was thirst. Summer heat bore down mercilessly, and water was scarce. Wells near the city were either poisoned or guarded by enemy forces. Women and children trudged miles each day in search of muddy puddles, carrying back precious skins of water under the threat of arrows. Hunger soon followed. With supplies dwindling, families survived on meagre rations of barley and whatever could be foraged from the barren hills. Livestock had long since been eaten. Even roots and leaves were boiled into weak stews. The Crusaders tried to storm the walls, but without siege equipment, their attacks failed. Families camped in the dust outside the city, exposed to both the elements and the missiles raining down from above. Yet in the midst of despair, morale was rekindled when ships arrived at Jaffa, bringing timber and craftsmen. Under blistering sun, men and women alike laboured to build great wooden towers and battering rams. Children carried water to the workers, while women stitched hides to shield the siege engines from fire. Religion infused every act. Processions of barefoot crusaders, priests carrying crosses, and families chanting prayers wound around the city, pleading for divine intervention. Chroniclers describe how the Crusaders' desperation transformed into a collective conviction that God would grant them victory if they endured just a little longer. At last, on July 15th, the siege towers rolled forward. Knights surged up ladders, while defenders rained fire and stones from above. In the chaos, families huddled behind wagons, listening to the thunder of battle, praying that this final assault would not end in disaster. Then the cry went up. The Crusaders had breached the walls. Jerusalem was taken. For the soldiers, it was a triumph of arms. For the families, it was the end of a pilgrimage. Women, children, and elders who had endured hunger, thirst, and endless marching now stepped into the holy city they had sacrificed everything to reach. The siege of Jerusalem was not just conquest. It was the culmination of suffering, faith, and survival for thousands of ordinary families who had carried the weight of the First Crusade on their weary shoulders. When the walls of Jerusalem finally fell in July of 1099, the Crusaders' victory was both triumphant and tragic. For knights, it was the fulfillment of Pope Urban's promise, a holy city reclaimed. But for the families who had walked across continents, buried children along the roadside, and endured years of starvation, the capture of Jerusalem marked not just the end of a war, but the close of a pilgrimage that had consumed their lives. Many did not live to see it. Thousands of families who had set out in 1096 perished along the way, leaving empty villages in Europe and unmarked graves scattered across Anatolia and Syria. For those who survived, Jerusalem was a bittersweet reward. Some established new lives in the Crusader states, settling in lands carved from conquest. Wives tended farms near Antioch or Jerusalem. Children grew up speaking a mix of Latin, Greek, and Arabic, and entire households attempted to plant roots in foreign soil. Others longed to return home. Yet the road back to Europe was as perilous as the march east. Many who had survived the sieges lacked the strength or resources for the journey. Husbands and wives faced heartbreaking choices: remain in the new kingdom of Jerusalem, or risk everything to return to the lands they had left years before. Some who did go home carried scars, physical and emotional, that never healed, forever marked by the hunger, disease, and death they had endured. The legacy of the First Crusade stretched beyond the survivors. In Europe, stories of families who marched east became legends, told in village squares and cloisters. The sight of women carrying water under arrows, of children surviving the deserts of Anatolia, and of entire households praying at the gates of Jerusalem redefined what it meant to take the cross. It was not just a knight's adventure, it was a movement of common men, women, and children who believed they were part of God's plan. In the East, the Crusader presence reshaped societies. Families who stayed became the backbone of the Latin kingdoms, but they lived always in tension with their neighbours, balancing survival with faith. The First Crusade ended with Jerusalem in Christian hands, but its true legacy was written in the resilience of ordinary families who transformed a holy war into a pilgrimage of survival. Their endurance proved that history is never made by knights alone, but by the countless unnamed lives that walk beside them. The reach of this power was staggering. The paterfamilias could decide whether a newborn infant was accepted into the family or abandoned to die. He could arrange marriages, dissolve them, disown his children, and claim ownership over all property acquired by his sons, no matter how old they were. In extreme cases, Roman law recognized his right to execute members of his household, though in practice, such punishments were rare and heavily frowned upon by society. Still, the knowledge that the law backed his authority created an atmosphere of obedience and fear, especially for the young. Yet, Patria Potestas was not only about cruelty or control. For many Roman fathers, it was also a responsibility. They were expected to guide, discipline, and provide for their families. Their role was as much about protection and continuity as it was about dominance. A father who abused his authority too often risked social criticism, for Roman society valued moderation and self-control, even in absolute power. Children raised under this system grew up with strict discipline. They learned early that their fortunes, education, and even their survival depended on their father's will. Sons might dream of independence, but until the father's death, they remained legally bound to his authority. A senator in his 40s could technically still be under his father's potestas, unable to hold property in his own name. Daughters, once married, usually passed from the power of their fathers into the authority of their husbands. This system ensured that Roman families remained tightly bound units, with loyalty and hierarchy reinforced at every level. The Roman state itself mirrored this structure. Emperors as fathers of the nation, citizens as children obliged to obey. In many ways, Patria Potestas was not just about families. It was the foundation upon which Rome built its social order. In Rome, childhood was not a carefree stage of life, but a carefully managed training ground for future citizens. From the moment a child was accepted into the household, a decision entirely in the hands of the paterfamilias, their upbringing was shaped by discipline, duty, and the values of Roman society. A Roman child was not viewed as an individual with freedom, but as an extension of the family line and a vessel for its honour. Infants were swaddled tightly, both for warmth and to ensure straight growth of limbs, according to Roman belief. The household nurse, usually a trusted slave or freedwoman, cared for them in early years, but the father's authority never faded into the background. Boys and girls were taught from the start to obey instantly, for obedience was the foundation of Roman virtue. Disobedience or laziness was often met with punishment, sometimes harsh, as Roman thought equated strict discipline with moral strength. Education began early. Boys were trained to read, write, and calculate, skills necessary for managing estates or pursuing public careers. More importantly, they were taught mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. Honour, courage, loyalty to Rome, and respect for authority were drilled into them. To grow up Roman was to grow up with the understanding that one's private life was inseparable from public duty. Girls received different instruction. While some daughters of elite families were educated in letters and philosophy, most were trained for domestic roles, spinning wool, managing servants, and preparing for eventual marriage. Yet even here, discipline was constant. A Roman girl was expected to embody modesty and obedience, virtues that would transfer seamlessly into her married life. Play did exist in a Roman childhood. Children had dolls, balls, and games of knucklebones. But leisure was always secondary to training. Even games often mirrored adult life, teaching strategy, imitation of military drills, or household management. What might look like child's play was in truth preparation for the roles they would one day assume. Above all, the shadow of patria potestas loomed. No matter their age, children never truly escaped their father's control until his death. A boy could rise to political office. A girl could marry into wealth and prestige, but both remained under the father's authority while he lived. Childhood in Rome, therefore, was less about innocence and more about apprenticeship to duty, a preparation for the relentless seriousness of Roman adulthood. A Roman household, or domus, was never simply a nuclear family in the modern sense. Instead, it was a sprawling and layered unit, often encompassing grandparents, married sons and their wives, daughters awaiting marriage, freedmen, slaves, and sometimes even distant relatives seeking protection under the authority of the paterfamilias. Within those walls, family life was both intimate and crowded, bound by hierarchy as much as by blood. The architecture of the Roman home reflected this structure. The atrium, with its open roof and central hearth, served as the symbolic heart of the household, where family rituals, client meetings, and ancestral worship took place. But behind this public facade stretched private rooms, courtyards, and service areas that housed dozens of people of varying rank. Privacy, as we know it, scarcely existed. The lives of children, servants, and elders unfolded in shared spaces, each role woven into the rhythm of the household. This arrangement created a peculiar mixture of solidarity and tension. On the one hand, extended families living together ensured continuity. Elders passed down wisdom and traditions, children absorbed values by constant example, and household loyalty was reinforced daily. For poorer families, pooling resources made survival possible. For wealthier ones, it showcased prosperity. A great house bustling with people was a testament to the father's power. On the other hand, life under one roof could also be suffocating. Married sons remained legally subordinate to their father, unable to control property or make independent decisions while he lived. Their wives, brought into the household through arranged marriages, had to navigate a hierarchy where mothers-in-law and sisters-in-law often wielded more influence. Tensions simmered in kitchens, courtyards, and women's quarters, even if outward respect was maintained. Slaves were part of this extended family, though always at the bottom. They cooked, cleaned, taught children, managed finances, and sometimes even became confidants. Their presence blurred the lines between household and workplace, reminding everyone that the Roman domus was as much an institution as it was a home. In many ways, the Roman household mirrored the Roman state, layered, hierarchical, and united under a single authority. The paterfamilias was the emperor, the extended family his citizens, and the slaves his subjugated subjects. Life under one roof was thus both sanctuary and stage, where every meal, quarrel, and celebration reinforced the values of discipline, loyalty, and obedience that defined Roman society itself. Marriage in ancient Rome was less about love and more about alliance. For aristocratic families, unions were political tools, binding noble houses together, strengthening ties, and securing wealth. Even among the lower classes, marriage was seen as a practical necessity for stability and survival. But in every case, it unfolded under the shadow of patria potestas, with the father arranging and approving his daughter's marriage as part of his duty to the household. Roman women entered marriage young, often in their early to mid-teens, to husbands who were usually older and more established. The wedding itself was a carefully orchestrated ritual, full of symbolism. The bride wore a flame-coloured veil, the flammeum, representing her transition into a new household. She was led to her husband's home in a procession lit by torches, signifying her passage from her father's authority into that of her husband. Or, in some cases, she remained legally under her father's potestas, depending on the form of marriage chosen. The role of the Roman wife was not insignificant, though it was bounded by expectations of modesty, obedience, and devotion to the family. Women managed the household economy, overseeing servants and slaves, managing food supplies, weaving textiles, and supervising the education of young children. A capable wife ensured the smooth running of the domus, and her reputation reflected directly on her husband. Yet women were not without influence. Behind the formal subordination lay subtle but powerful forms of agency. Elite Roman women, especially in the late Republic and Empire, could wield significant sway through family connections, property inheritance, or their role as mothers of future leaders. Figures like Livia, wife of Augustus, remind us that while the system was patriarchal, women could shape politics and dynastic futures from behind the scenes. For ordinary Roman women, the daily reality was harsher. They endured frequent pregnancies, high risks of childbirth, and the expectation of tireless labour. Divorce, however, was surprisingly common in Rome, and either spouse could initiate it, though the father still had a say in the fate of children, who remained tied to his authority. Marriage in Rome was thus a paradox. It reinforced hierarchy and discipline, yet it also allowed women to carve spaces of quiet influence. Wives stood as the glue of the household, balancing obedience with resourcefulness, ensuring that the Roman family, the foundation of Roman society, endured. If patria potestas gave the father absolute authority, it also made him responsible for shaping his children into proper Romans. Childhood in Rome was not seen as a time for idle play, but as preparation for duty, whether in politics, war, or household management. Education was both practical and moral, designed to create citizens who could uphold the Republic, or later the Empire, with loyalty and discipline. The earliest lessons took place at home. Mothers and nurses guided toddlers in speech and basic manners, but the father oversaw their moral instruction. Roman children were taught the values of pietas, duty, gravitas, seriousness, and disciplina, self-control. Tales of ancestors' deeds were recited to inspire courage, and boys especially were reminded that their lives should add honor to the family name. To shame one's lineage was considered worse than failure. Formal schooling began around the age of 7, though it depended on class. Wealthy boys were sent to a ludus, where a literator taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Wax tablets, styluses, and scrolls of Homer or Virgil filled their lessons. From there, they advanced to a grammaticus, studying literature, history, and rhetoric, the skills needed for political life. The pinnacle was training with a rhetor, where they practiced public speaking, persuasion, and debate, essential weapons for Rome's courts and senate. Girls, by contrast, rarely received advanced education unless born into elite families. Most were trained in domestic skills, weaving, managing servants, and running a household, though some well-born daughters studied literature, philosophy, or even music. In wealthier homes, private tutors were hired for both boys and girls, often educated Greek slaves, whose influence quietly spread Hellenistic culture throughout Rome. Discipline was harsh. Physical punishment was common, whether at home or in school. To fail in diligence or to disrespect elders was not tolerated. The rod, the cane, and public scolding were all considered tools of moral correction. To a Roman mind, pain taught lessons that words alone could not. Still, learning was not confined to scrolls and classrooms. Boys observed their fathers in the forum, on military campaigns, or at family rituals. They absorbed Roman identity through participation, marching with soldiers, speaking in public, offering sacrifices at temples. Education was a total immersion, blending academics, religion, and civic duty into one. Through this training, Roman children were molded into heirs of the Republic's traditions, their lives directed towards service of family and state alike. If Roman law bound families under the power of the father, religion bound them to the unseen world of gods and ancestors. Every household in Rome was both a dwelling and a shrine, filled with rituals that kept divine favor close and misfortune at bay. In fact, Roman religion was not confined to public temples and state ceremonies. It began at the hearth, within the family home. At the heart of this domestic religion stood the lares and penates, protective spirits of the household and pantry. Their images, often small figurines, were placed in a shrine known as the lararium, usually located near the kitchen or courtyard. Each morning, the family made offerings of wine, bread, or incense to these spirits, seeking blessings for prosperity, health, and safety. The father, as high priest of the household, led these rites, just as he commanded authority in every other sphere of family life. Ancestor worship was equally central. Romans believed the manes, the spirits of the dead, lingered and continued to influence the living. Families honored their departed with annual festivals such as Parentalia, where tombs were decorated and offerings of food and wine made to ensure peace for the dead and protection for the living. Forgetting one's ancestors was unthinkable. Their memory safeguarded the continuity of the family line. Children grew up surrounded by wax masks of illustrious forebears displayed during funerals and carried in public processions. These images reminded them that they were not individuals alone, but heirs to a lineage demanding honor. Daily rituals infused ordinary life. Lighting the hearth fire, pouring a libation at dinner, or blessing the doorway were all acts of piety. Women played a vital role in maintaining these observances, tending the hearth and assisting in sacrifices. While men carried out public priesthoods and civic rites, the quiet devotion of mothers and daughters ensured that the family's sacred bonds endured within the home. Religion also reinforced hierarchy. The paterfamilias, as the family's priest, embodied the link between gods, ancestors, and the living. His role gave divine sanction to his authority, making obedience not only a legal duty, but also a sacred obligation. In Roman thought, a family without piety was doomed to disorder. The hearth was not just a place of warmth, but a channel between mortal and divine. To neglect the spirits was to invite chaos. To honor them was to guarantee that the household, and Rome itself, endured under the watchful eyes of gods and ancestors alike. While Roman law and religion gave the household its structure, it was the daily routine, especially meals, that gave family life its rhythm. In a society where food was both necessity and symbol, the act of eating together was not merely about nourishment. It was a performance of hierarchy, a chance to reinforce family bonds, and an expression of Roman identity. The Roman day began at dawn. Men prepared to attend to their duties, whether managing estates, appearing in the forum, or fulfilling military obligations, while women oversaw household tasks, directing slaves and servants. Children studied under tutors or practiced skills, while slaves bustled about carrying water, grinding grain, or preparing meals. Despite the constant activity, life was punctuated by moments of gathering, most importantly around the table. The cena, or main meal of the day, held pride of place. In elite households, it could be a lavish affair with multiple courses, beginning in the late afternoon and stretching into the evening. Families reclined on couches in the triclinium, the formal dining room, while servants presented dishes in carefully ordered stages: eggs, vegetables, meats, and sweetened desserts. Wine flowed freely, watered down according to custom, and conversations meandered between philosophy, politics, and family matters. Even in humbler households, the cena was significant. Families gathered around simple wooden tables, sharing bread, porridge, beans, cheese, and seasonal fruits. Meat was rarer for the poor, but the communal act of eating carried the same meaning. The table was the heart of the household, where discipline eased and conversation flourished. Meals also reflected hierarchy. The paterfamilias presided over the table, deciding seating, portions, and even the flow of conversation. Guests, when present, reinforced the family's status, and children learned from a young age the rituals of hospitality and the art of polite dining. Women played a dual role, participating in meals, but also supervising preparation and ensuring the household displayed refinement, even in modest settings. Beyond the cena, smaller meals structured the day. A light breakfast, the unticulum, of bread, fruit, or cheese began the morning, while a midday snack, prandium, sustained workers and students. But it was the evening meal that lingered in memory, for it was here that families relaxed, stories were told, and bonds of loyalty and identity were renewed. In the end, meals in Rome were more than sustenance. They were daily rituals that reflected order, status, and the enduring unity of the Roman household, a unity that echoed the greater order of Rome itself. No Roman household was complete without slaves. From the poorest home to the grandest villa, enslaved people formed the backbone of daily life. They were cooks, tutors, nurses, scribes, cleaners, farmhands, and companions, moving silently through the household and ensuring its smooth operation. In truth, the Roman family was never just father, mother, and children. It was an institution supported by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of invisible hands. Slavery in Rome was not based on race, but on conquest, debt, or birth. War captives filled the markets, while children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved themselves. Their roles in the home varied according to skill. An educated Greek slave might become a tutor, shaping the minds of noble Roman children, while others toiled in kitchens, stables, or fields. A wealthy domus was measured not only by its architecture, but by the number and specialization of its slaves. Inside the household, slaves occupied an uneasy position. They lived among the family, but were never part of it. The paterfamilias held absolute authority over them, just as he did over wife and children. Punishments could be harsh: beatings, branding, or even crucifixion for serious offences. Yet at the same time, many slaves became indispensable. A loyal nurse might be remembered with affection for raising generations of children, and a skilled steward might effectively manage estates, wielding authority over free men in his master's name. Freedom was possible. Slaves who demonstrated loyalty, skill, or accumulated savings could be manumitted, becoming freedmen, liberty. For freedmen, manumission opened a new world. They could marry legally, own property, and raise children free of the stigma of slavery. Many remained attached to their former masters as clients, bound by ties of loyalty and mutual benefit. In this way, the line between slave, freedman, and family blurred. Households became networks of dependence, stretching far beyond blood. Children grew up surrounded by these figures. They were raised by enslaved nurses, taught by enslaved tutors, and often formed deep emotional bonds with those who served them. Yet even these relationships were shaped by hierarchy, reminding every Roman child that society was built on layers of obedience and control. In truth, Roman family life cannot be imagined without slaves and freedmen. They were the silent machinery of the household, sustaining the illusion of noble leisure, discipline, and order. Their presence made Roman domestic life possible, even as their absence from official family honor exposed the contradictions at the heart of Rome's proud ideals. If Roman life began under the stern authority of the paterfamilias, it ended with rituals designed to preserve memory and secure continuity. Death in Rome was not treated as a private matter, but as a family event, full of symbolism and consequence. A household did not simply mourn, it reaffirmed its place in the chain of ancestors and descendants, ensuring that the family's honor outlived the individual. When a Roman died, the body was laid out in the atrium, the heart of the home, surrounded by mourners. Professional mourners might be hired to wail, while relatives tore their garments and covered their heads in ashes. Children watched as death was folded into the fabric of everyday life, learning that mortality was less an ending than a transition into ancestral memory. The funeral procession itself was a spectacle. Masks, imagines, of illustrious ancestors were carried, worn by actors, to remind the living of the greatness of the family line. Sons followed in solemn order, daughters wept, and the crowd bore witness. For noble families, this was not just mourning, it was public propaganda, affirming that the family's legacy stretched back generations and would endure into the future. Inheritance was the most practical and far-reaching consequence of death. Roman law gave the paterfamilias total control over property, which only passed to his heirs upon his death. Sons, long subordinate under patria potestas, finally gained independence when their father died, inheriting wealth, land, and authority over their own households. Daughters, in contrast, typically received dowries or smaller shares, though wealthy fathers might provide generous inheritances to ensure advantageous marriages. Wills, testamenta, were solemn affairs, recited before witnesses. They revealed not just the distribution of wealth but the loyalties and priorities of the deceased. Freedmen might be rewarded with land or citizenship, slaves might be granted freedom, and political allies could be honored. In this way, death itself became another performance of Roman hierarchy and obligation. For the family, ancestor worship carried on the legacy. Annual rites, like parentalia, kept the dead present in the lives of the living. Children were reminded that they bore the names, duties, and honor of those who came before. To forget one's ancestors was a kind of second death, erasure from memory. In the end, Roman family life was a circle, from birth under a father's authority, through discipline and service, to death and remembrance. Even in silence, the dead spoke through law, ritual, and memory, ensuring that in Rome, the family, not the individual, was eternal.